So I'll give a very short presentation, introduction to ethics, and then slowly make it hopefully relevant to data engineering and AI. But I think it's good to have a general sort of idea what it is to do ethics in your practice. So maybe as an opening question, can you think for yourself of an example of unethical behavior in your own practice or field? Like what is something where you wonder, hey, is that the right thing to do? Or am I doing something wrong here? Or is something wrong happening here? And think about what makes it unethical. And I want to do this, I want to kind of start from this beginning to just give you an intuition that ethics is not something that happens in the ivory tower of philosophy, but something that we're all constantly confronted with, but often feel unequipped to act upon. It's like, oh, I'm not an expert on this, or isn't it arbitrary? But as humans, we're all choice makers, right? We choose if we go on a holiday or we stay home to take care of a ill family member. And we have a intuition here that's, well, the one thing is maybe the right thing to do and the other isn't, or I'll need some argumentation for what I'm doing here. The same is the case when you're a data engineer. Maybe somewhat edge example, but do you want to work on a system that recognizes emotions and is used for forms of surveillance, or are you going to work to make a recognition system for unmarked graves that helps people retrieve their loved ones, right? Like, where are you going to apply your skills? It's a choice you make that you'll have to think about and stand behind. So there's always this broad sense of ethics in the background of what you're doing. Now, what is ethics? Somewhat formally, an initial definition. When we think of ethics, we're talking about moral standards of what we consider to be right and wrong, that we say prescribe how we ought to act, right? So it's unlike statements of facts that are true or false, and I'll appear into that in a minute. One way to introduce this field is to ask, what should I do? How should I act? How should I live? What sort of person should I strive to be? This sounds very big, but what sort of engineer should I strive to be in my practice? And maybe the clearest of maybe best sort of description is to ask, what do we owe to, or how do we treat those that are affected by our actions and through our practices, right? What are the impacts and consequences of what we do? Very early on in building a system, we have no clue as what would happen far, far down the line, but can we nevertheless, or should we nevertheless, take that into account as much as possible? Yeah. So another question I then want to ask, you should ask yourself, do you feel equipped to make moral choices in your engineering practices, right? There's always a certain tendency to think that, well, I have a clear task as an engineer, I have a design brief, I have a clear set of targets that I have to meet, I'll just do those, and there's clear sort of criteria that I have to meet, and once I get those, I'm done. And the moral choices are for someone else. Or if I feel some kind of important choice that feels moral to me, it's not for me. Maybe, there's an ethics committee, or I'll ask a manager, or at some point society will respond, as often happens. So I think this idea is important to emphasize that everyone is equipped to make moral decisions. And to illustrate that, I always want to sort of point out the two common misconceptions that people might have about ethics. But very briefly, the one is the objection of what's called subjectivism, which is the idea that, well, aren't moral statements just reflections of subjective perceptions and personal preferences? That is, it's almost like a matter of taste, right? You like ice cream, I don't like ice cream, that's fine. Well, that's not quite right. And the other misconception is like, well, isn't it sort of popular opinion? We as a society think that is, moral statements are merely reflections of public opinion. In both cases, you would think that, right, there's no argument or no sort of right or wrong about right or wrong. Well, the argument against moral subjectivism is that generally when you have a moral disagreement, you're not saying to one another, oh, that's just a matter of taste. Like, you like ice cream, I don't like ice cream. Sure, we can sort of, live with that. But I say, I think it's okay to steal for the rich, and you say it's not okay to steal from the rich. That's not the same kind of difference of agreement. We're going to have an argument about it, right? So in the moral sphere, it's not subjective in the sense that we expect to give reasons to one each other for our ethical choices and to argue why they're correct. You might not come to a final agreement. We might still disagree, but we do feel that it's a, a, a an argument, right, between each other. So it's not arbitrary in that sense. The same with popular opinion. The typical example, well, if ethics are up to popular opinion, then, right, we should be happy with the leaders we choose or the laws we passed, even though intuitively we would think, well, those aren't quite right. They're unjust, right? Kind of analogously, it's not a matter of popular opinion whether the earth is flat or round. We think there's an argument to be had, and there's evidence to be put to the table. And it's not the quite same way with ethics, but it's also not arbitrary either or just a democratic decision. And this is actually just a quick example. We see this idea that somehow ethics is a matter of whatever the majority thinks, is sometimes even baked into certain machine learning decision makings. I won't go into the details here, but when people decide on what is the right conception of fairness in relationship to the outcome of some decision algorithm, right? What do we think? Is it okay to use certain features or not in your data set? Then some people argue, well, fairness is just what the general population deems acceptable, right? Or deems accurate enough, or deems an acceptable disparity enough. That's sort of a very pragmatic solution, and it could even be defended in some sense. But again, you're not really giving an answer here to the ethical problem. And that's why ethics is really hard, right? One thing I already emphasized here before I go to the next step here is that coming to a good ethical solution or a moral judgment is very much a social interactive process, right? Not just a majority decision, but the outcome of a kind of deliberation. So now I want to just make a couple of distinctions still about ethical theory, and then I'll say something general about questions that might be relevant to your practice or just some initial steps towards that. I think one distinction that's important to make is the so-called descriptive normative distinction. I already hinted at that. You can make this distinction between descriptive and normative ethics. And descriptive ethics is basically, well, explanations, factual statements about what people actually do or what people think is right or wrong. So that's more in the field of biology, psychology, anthropology. When we do normative ethics, we're actually trying to give prescriptive accounts on how we ought to act and understand ourselves as moral beings or, as moral engineers. And this is more a question of philosophy. And this descriptive normative distinction is important because there's continuously a tendency to sort of slide between them without really noticing. So the distinction can be illustrated very clearly in two different statements, right? There's the statement of Homo sapiens is a warring species. That's a descriptive statement. That's simply true or false according to our definition of warring. And the other one is a normative statement. People should not make war. War is bad. It's a judgment. It's not really true or false. It's something you endorse or not, or think is a well-reasoned or a well-grounded judgment. We see this sort of tendency to try and turn normative statements into descriptive statements often. Well, there's sort of a judgment, moral judgment component here, but we try to present it as a matter of fact, but also the other way around. So maybe in the case of data science, data engineering, you can have a prescriptive claim in the form of our prediction algorithm for consumer creditworthiness has an error rate epsilon. That's sort of factual. That's simply true or false. But in effect, that's once that's operationalized or once that's accepted as fact and the system is huge, this actually turns into the system making the judgment that people in this neighborhood should not get along, right? So here's a picture of maybe familiar to many of you, this idea of redlining that based on zip code, which actually coded for ethnic background or class, you would not be able to get along. And we see increasingly this sort of what we now call digital redlining, right? That there are certain biases in the system that even though the system is perfectly accurate and meets certain specifications as desired, they actually end up making judgments that are, have moral import. People are judged creditworthy or not on an illegitimate basis. We see that this slipping happens all the time. So that when in machine learning, there's a tendency to talk about reliability or accurateness or whatever technical term there is. It seems descriptive, but it has a huge sort of normative import. There's kind of judgments enclosed in that. And it's very hard to sort of get at that and also to debate those in a sense. So this is a way of saying how difficult it is to even sort of bring ethics to the table as you're doing your work. Or at least that's my impression often when I talk to engineers. They want to sort of, put it back into the algorithm and avoid having to have a debate about the morality of it or the ethics of it or the specific judgment encoded. Next, another set of distinctions or a set of terms that are maybe good to keep in mind or to think about as you do your work in practice. 3 key ideas: values, which I take to be lasting convictions that people believe are desirable to pursue, promote, preserve, or protect. These are often abstract goals of ideas, and these come up, right? Like, oh, we value privacy, so we make the system such that it somehow achieves that or is oriented towards that ideal, or it's sustainable, or it's fair, or it's efficient is probably the value that most people take as default, right? It has to be efficient, but that's a value. Norms, we think of those as the rule that prescribe which actions are morally required, permitted, or forbidden. They often translate values into concrete behaviors, into principle, right? We value life, so thou shalt not kill. We value privacy, so thou shalt have good encryption, or whatever you think is the good norm here. And finally, we have virtues, which sort of refers more to the agent, to the character that makes someone a good person or that allows people to lead good lives. In this case, virtues might be what are actually virtues of a good data engineer. The typical ones for engineers are often like, well, to be precise, to be meticulous, to be et cetera, et cetera. But what else comes in if you think about it from this perspective? And these 3 we'll return to values in a bit. So I think these are good distinctions to have and to think about and ask yourself, like, what values do I actually work with? How does that translate in certain norms? What virtues do I have if I want to do my job well? And what does that mean? A different distinction useful to understand. I'm not going to do actual sort of real moral theory here. One might have come across this in some sense, but I think it's important to see that there's often also different points of emphasis in moral theory. There is kind of the view from consequences, consequentialism, utilitarianism, that is, the consequences matter. Should we look at the consequences of the action? Does it maximize a certain value when we do this, right? This is kind of the general default moral theory for most engineer, because you just look at, or a scientist in general, maybe, right? You just look at the outputs and do they meet certain criteria? If not, we'll improve it until it does, we get the right consequences. But also in a wider sense, when it comes to governance in general, we look at the consequences because it tends to be the most measurable, right? And the question always here, does the end justify the means? And, a proper utilitarian would say, well, if you want to maximize happiness, yes, the end does justify the means. We can make certain sacrifices for the greater good. That's one perspective that is, I think, quite dominant. The rights perspective, you look here at the action itself. Is the action itself the right one? In this case, we can say, is the action done according to the rule that we want to uphold, right? So this is a perspective where you sort of look from a sense of basic rights or human rights, right? So we cannot sacrifice someone for the greater good because that someone has certain basic rights that we can never act again, right? And we see this in all kind of, I don't know, one of these very broad dilemmas, security versus privacy, right? Like, can we violate someone's privacy in the name of security? The consequence perspective might say, yeah, often no. The rights perspective might have much more problems with that. And then the final sort of point of emphasis is to look at the agent itself, right? How an agent itself, through moral learning, has understood themselves to be a good person in the role that they have. So this sort of looks more at, well, if I'm an engineer working in a particular field of AI or data engineering, what does it mean for me to be a good data engineer? How do I respond to certain situations? How do I step back and reflect on what I'm doing? that's a sort of more individual whole agent view that is a bit different than the consequences and rights view that tend to be more abstract and according to principles. But again, these are not mutually exclusive in some sense either. All right. Now, what does that mean when we talk about the axis of machine learning? I'm not going to say how all this applies, but if you think about data science and AI, it's actually sort of a set of different fields of ethics that currently exist. There's ethics of technology, where we really often focus on what are the goals and impacts of a new technology, who are the winners and losers, who's benefiting or not, and is that justified? Think about unknown consequences. What kind of regulation do we need? How is that justified? What are practices of maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. A bit more specific, of course, you'll have to deal with data ethics. What is good data? What does that even mean in terms of what you need, what you want? What is prohibited? What's necessary? What form should it have? Even deeper, you're going to look at algorithmic ethics. What is just or fair in an algorithm? What does that even mean? How do we translate notions of accuracy, reliability, efficiency, complexity, etc., into moral terms like it's just or fair? Like when is it morally adequate instead of just adequate according to some criteria? And finally, that's maybe more high level again, environmental ethics, or also low level. What is a sustainable form of machine learning or data practice, right? And sustainable in either, a very local sense or in a very global sense. All these sort of questions sort of are now very relevant to AI and data science. So I just wanted to mention that and say a little bit maybe about, well, if there's time. Sorry. Well, this is just a very general sort of broad schema of what I think you can think about as the system of doing data science or AI. You have a world, that world is translated into data, that data is inputted in a system, there's an output. Based on that output, certain actions are undertaken, which impact individuals and society and shape the world again. But it's important to realize that whatever you're working on, it always exists in a specific and complex social context where specific moral concerns become relevant at different points in the process, right? So you can just look at the scheme and at every step ask what is actually happening here from a moral point of view. Well, one theme that always gets mentioned is, of course, biases. There's biases on every step of this schema I've just shown, right? And a bias just being something like quite neutrally initially a preference or inclination for or against something, right? But often accompanied by a tendency to ignore the merits or relative alternative of others' points of view. But biases aren't necessarily bad, but they can definitely be bad because what you're ignoring is something that you should not ignore. You're misrecognizing someone else. You're harming someone else because you're not fully taking them in because of your bias. And we know, or you might know, there's many biases, right, that humans have. There's an increasing list of types of, well, here only cognitive biases in terms of information processing. And obviously these are reproduced in machine learning, right? Generally, of course, one of the great defenses of AI machine learning is always that it's supposedly less biased. But you can wonder from the get-go, is that true, right? To some degree, the world we live in is unjust. And as we take data from that world for our systems, we're just going to put those injustices in there. So there's no reason to think that it will somehow be less biased, unless you really work on that and engineer it in that way. But we know that generally existing biases are easily reproduced, and they might even be exasperated by machine learning. On top of that, algorithms can themselves be biased in ways that we don't know. So that's sort of the black box or transparency issue, right? We sort of see the outputs and we think they're satisfying certain criteria, and it all seems to be fine for a little while in a certain domain. But as we don't really know what the algorithms are actually doing or what the system is actually doing, this might start to drift, and we don't know why. We don't know anymore where the bias is coming from. So the challenge is always how to mitigate these risks of harmful consequences to a degree that we find morally acceptable to ensure fairness. So again, mitigate, that's when you're talking about consequences to a degree we find morally acceptable. Here the question becomes, okay, who finds this morally acceptable, right? So this again returns to my point that it seems like a really big burden to bear as an engineer if you're fully responsible for that. And also, why would you be responsible for knowing what is acceptable for the level of bias or inaccuracy or unreliability of system? Clearly, that's a matter that is for society or in a conversation between all the various stakeholders. Right? And the question then is, how do you organize that? So in terms of mitigation, just the same sort of schema again, right? From world to the data, there's already interpretation and translation. There's all kinds of things you can talk about there, what could go wrong and how to mitigate those risks. Once the data goes in the system, how do you account for mistakes or badly sourced data or existing biases? Next, the biases in the system. And then finally, a really important step maybe is like, once you have an output of the system, what do you do with it, right? Once you have a machine learning system and it's really inaccurate, maybe you'll use it to for some recommendation system for advertisements and you accept a high error rate. But if it's for in the domain of healthcare or in the domain of policing, you have you have much stricter measurements. So the question is always, how is it situated? You can never look at it in isolation. You have to look at it as part of the larger system to see what kind of moral issues are at stake, right? What are the actual risks and impact over what time period, etc. And goes back into the world, and you can ask yourself, how is it to be improved or is it overall harmful?